Jaslyn had always prided herself on being the kind of woman who could balance everything: her career, her marriage, and her own sense of self. At 34, she lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Chicago, where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns created an illusion of perfection. Her home was cozy, but filled with art. Paintings she'd created over the years adorned the walls, each piece telling a story of emotions she couldn't always put into words. Jaslyn taught art at a local high school, pouring her heart into nurturing creativity in teenagers who often seemed more interested in their phones than paintbrushes. Her husband, Rio, was her opposite in almost every way. Where Jaslyn thrived on connection and expression, Rio found comfort in logic and structure. A software engineer for a tech startup downtown, he spent most of his days buried in lines of code or glued to his laptop screen. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple, a beautiful blend of creativity and intellect. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. That Friday evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jaslyn stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her earrings. She had planned this night meticulously: a reservation at La Belle, one of the city's finest restaurants, soft jazz playing in the background, candlelit tables. It was all designed to reignite the spark that had dimmed between them. For weeks, she'd felt like a ghost in her own marriage, invisible to the man who once looked at her like she was the only thing worth seeing. Rio emerged from the bedroom, scrolling through his phone as usual. He barely glanced up when Jaslyn said, "Ready?" His distracted nod made her stomach tighten with frustration. Still, she forced a smile and grabbed her purse. If there was one thing Jaslyn knew how to do, it was mask her disappointment, at least until she couldn't anymore. The drive to the restaurant was silent except for the hum of the car engine. Rio tapped away on his phone, responding to work emails, despite having promised her a no-tech evening. Jaslyn stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past. She wondered if Rio even noticed how hard she tried anymore, or worse, if he cared. When they arrived at La Belle, Jaslyn took a deep breath and reminded herself why they were here. This wasn't just dinner. It was a chance to reconnect, to remind Rio of the love they'd built together. But as they were seated and handed menus, Rio's attention remained firmly fixed on his phone. The waiter approached, offering a polite smile as he introduced himself as Lucas. "Good evening," Lucas said warmly, glancing between Jaslyn and Rio. "Can I start you both off with something to drink?" Before Rio could respond, Jaslyn blurted out, "Oh, he's not my husband. Just, a close friend." The words slipped out before she could stop them, fueled by a mix of anger and sadness bubbling beneath the surface. Rio didn't react immediately, but when he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. It wasn't shock or hurt. It was something colder, more distant. And in that moment, Jaslyn realized she didn't recognize the man sitting across from her anymore. As the waiter walked away, the tension between them thickened. What had started as an attempt to salvage their relationship now felt like another step toward its unraveling. The weight of Jaslyn's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Lucas, the waiter, seemed oblivious to the tension as he returned moments later with their drinks, a glass of red wine for Jaslyn and sparkling water for Rio. "Here you go," he said cheerfully, placing the glasses on the table. "Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes?" Rio finally set his phone down, though his movements were deliberate and mechanical, as if every gesture required effort. He glanced at the menu briefly before handing it back to Lucas without meeting Jaslyn's eyes. "I'll have the steak, medium rare," he said flatly. Jaslyn hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. She hadn't even looked at the menu properly, too preoccupied with the chaos swirling inside her mind. I'll take the salmon," she murmured, avoiding eye contact with both Rio and Lucas. As Lucas scribbled down their orders, he leaned slightly toward Jaslyn, his tone light and conversational. So how long have you two known each other? The question felt innocent enough, but it struck Jaslyn like a punch to the gut. She froze, unsure how to respond. Rio remained silent, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the restaurant. Walls. Jaslyn forced a laugh, the sound brittle and hollow. "Oh, we've known each other for years," she said quickly, glancing at Rio out of the corner of her eye. "But it's complicated." Lucas raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Complicated, huh? Well, aren't all good relationships?" He chuckled softly, then added, "Anyway, your meals will be out shortly. Let me know if you need anything else." When Lucas walked away, the silence between Jaslyn and Rio became unbearable. Jaslyn stared at her wine glass, swirling the crimson liquid around its edges. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to shake Rio out of whatever emotional fortress he'd built around himself. But instead, she whispered, "Why did you let him think we're not married?" Rio shrugged, his expression indifferent. "Does it matter what he thinks?" "Yes," Jaslyn snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Several heads turned in their direction, but she didn't care. "Of course it matters. You're my husband, Rio? Or have you forgotten that part too while you're busy ignoring me?" Rio's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jaslyn thought he might actually say something meaningful. Instead, he picked up his water glass and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. It was infuriating, the way he could sit there so calmly, as if her pain meant nothing. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence. Every attempt Jaslyn made to engage Rio, whether it was commenting on the food or asking about his day, was met with monosyllabic responses or outright dismissal. By the time dessert arrived, she had given up trying altogether. It wasn't until they were leaving the restaurant that the full weight of the evening hit her. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Jaslyn paused under the glow of a street lamp, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Do you even care anymore?" she asked, her voice trembling. "About us? About me?" Rio stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting second, Jaslyn thought she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, regret, maybe, or guilt. But just as quickly it vanished, replaced by the same stoic mask he always wore. "I'm doing the best I can, Jaslyn," he said quietly, his tone devoid of any real conviction. And with that, he walked ahead, leaving her standing alone beneath, the dim light wondering if his best would ever be enough. By the time they arrived home, Jaslyn's frustration had reached a boiling point. The quiet ride back from the restaurant had been suffocating, each mile stretching longer than the last. Rio hadn't said a word since his cryptic response outside the restaurant. "I'm doing the best I can." And those 6 words echoed in Jaslyn's mind like an accusation rather than an explanation. As soon as they stepped inside, she slammed her purse onto the kitchen counter, the sound reverberating through the otherwise silent house. "You know what your problem is?" she burst out, her voice shaking with emotion. "You don't even try anymore. You act like this marriage is some kind of obligation you can just check off your to-do list while you bury yourself in work. And emails." Rio froze mid-step, his hand still gripping the door handle. For a moment, he didn't respond, and Jaslyn wondered if he'd simply ignore her again and retreat into silence. But then he turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say, Jaslyn? That I'm sorry? That I'll magically fix everything?" "Yes," Jaslyn shot back, tears welling up in her eyes. "I want you to care enough to fight for us instead of shutting me out. Do you even realize how lonely I feel? How invisible?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly looked away, unwilling to let him see her cry. But it was too late. Rio's shoulders sagged slightly, as though her words had hit their mark. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "I'm not shutting you out because I don't care," he said finally, his tone softer but tinged with frustration. I'm shutting you out because I don't know how to fix things. Every time I try, it feels like I make it worse. Jaslyn blinked, caught off guard by his sudden vulnerability. This wasn't the cold, distant Rio she'd grown accustomed to. It was someone else entirely. Someone who seemed just as lost and broken as she felt. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her anger giving way to confusion. "Fix what?" "We're not broken, Rio. Not unless you stop trying." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been struggling with everything. Work has been overwhelming, and I've been so focused on proving myself there that I haven't paid attention to what really matters. To you." Jaslyn stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his words came from a place of honesty, but years of disappointment made it hard to let her guard down. "So why didn't you tell me any of this before?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you just keep pushing me away?" Rio shook his head, looking more defeated than she'd ever seen him. "Because I didn't think you'd understand. And honestly, I didn't know how to put it into words without sounding like a failure." The room fell silent after that, the weight of his admission hanging between them like a fragile thread. Jaslyn felt torn. Part of her wanted to lash out, to punish him for all the nights she'd spent feeling neglected and unimportant. But another part of her, the part that still loved him despite everything, ached to reach out, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Finally, she took a step forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're right about one thing," she said softly. "We can't fix anything if we don't talk about it. But Rio, you have to meet me halfway. I can't do this alone anymore." For the first time that evening, Rio met her gaze directly, his dark eyes filled with something resembling regret. "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. Truly." It wasn't much, but it was a start. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself. As they stood there in the dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of their fractured relationship, Jaslyn allowed herself a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. But deep down, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The days following their late-night confrontation were tense but quieter, as if both Jaslyn and Rio were tiptoeing around the fragile truce they'd established. Jaslyn found herself replaying their conversation over and over in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. Rio's admission that he felt like a failure gnawed at her. She had always assumed his emotional distance was intentional, not born out of insecurity or struggle. But something about his words didn't add up entirely. If he truly wanted to fix things, why hadn't he taken any concrete steps before now? Her curiosity got the better of her one evening when Rio left for an impromptu work meeting. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Jaslyn wandered into his home office, a space she rarely entered, and sat down at his desk. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a stark contrast to the warmth of her art studio. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard of his laptop before she hesitated. Was this invasion of privacy justified? She told herself it was. After all, understanding what Rio had been hiding could be the key to saving their marriage. After a few minutes of fumbling with passwords, his birthday worked, unsurprisingly. She opened his files. Most were work-related documents and spreadsheets, but tucked away in a folder labeled Personal was something unexpected. A series of emails exchanged between Rio and someone named Dr. Emily Carter, a licensed therapist specializing in couples counseling. Jaslyn's breath caught in her throat as she scrolled through the messages. Rio had reached out months ago, scheduling sessions that never happened because he canceled them last minute. In one email he wrote, "I know we need help, but I'm afraid of failing even more than I already have." Another message outlined potential dates and times for appointments, each marked with tentative notes like, "maybe this time," or "too nervous to commit." Her heart sank as she read further. Rio hadn't just been struggling. He'd been trying to address their issues privately, without involving her. While part of her appreciated his effort, another part felt betrayed. Why hadn't he told her? Did he think she wouldn't support him? Or worse, did he assume she'd blame him entirely for their problems? When Rio returned home later that night, Jaslyn was waiting for him in the living room, his laptop resting on the coffee table. He froze in the doorway, his keys still dangling from his hand. "What are you doing with my computer?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. "I needed answers," Jaslyn replied, her tone steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Why didn't you tell me about the therapy sessions, Rio? Why did you keep this from me?" Rio sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to retreat back into silence, but then he sank onto the couch beside her. "Because I was ashamed," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought if I couldn't figure things out on my own, it meant I wasn't good enough for you. And I didn't want to drag you into something I wasn't sure I could follow through with." Jaslyn stared at him, torn between anger and sympathy. "You don't get to decide how much I'm involved in our relationship," she said firmly. "This isn't just your burden to carry. It's ours, together." Rio nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I know that now," he murmured. "But it's hard to unlearn years of thinking I have to handle everything alone." They sat in silence for a while, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Jaslyn broke the quiet. "If we're going to fix this, we need to do it together. No more secrets, no more pretending everything is fine when it's not. Deal?" Rio hesitated, then extended his hand toward hers. "Deal," he said quietly, his grip firm yet gentle. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a promise, one they both hoped they could keep. As Jaslyn closed the laptop and placed it back on the table, she felt a flicker of resolve. Uncovering Rio's secret hadn't solved their problems overnight, but it had given her insight into the fears and insecurities driving his behavior. Now, it was up to both of them to take the next step, to rebuild what they'd lost, brick by fragile brick. The next morning, Jaslyn decided to clear her head with a walk around the neighborhood. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and the golden leaves crunching beneath her boots provided a comforting rhythm. She needed space to process everything that had happened. The revelation about Rio's canceled therapy sessions, his confession of shame, and their tentative agreement to move forward together. Her mind felt like a tangled web of emotions: guilt for snooping, relief at finally understanding Rio's perspective, and lingering uncertainty about whether they could truly repair what had been broken. As she turned the corner onto Main Street, she spotted Brew Haven, the cozy cafe where she often stopped for coffee before heading to school. It wasn't part of her usual routine on weekends, but something about the warm glow spilling from its windows drew her in. She ordered a cappuccino and settled into a corner table, pulling out her journal to jot down some thoughts. Writing always helped her untangle her feelings, especially when words felt too heavy to say aloud. Moments later, she heard a familiar voice. "Jaslyn, is that you?" She looked up to see Lucas, the waiter from La Belle. He smiled warmly, balancing a tray of pastries in one hand. "I didn't expect to run into you here," he said, setting the tray down on a nearby table. "How have you been?" Jaslyn hesitated, unsure how much she wanted to share with someone who essentially knew nothing about her beyond that awkward dinner. But there was something disarming about Lucas. His easygoing demeanor and genuine curiosity made her feel safe. "I've been figuring things out," she replied vaguely, gesturing for him to sit if he had a moment. Lucas glanced at the clock behind the counter. "My break starts in 5 minutes. Mind if I join you then?" When he returned with a steaming cup of tea, the two began chatting casually. At first, the conversation stayed light, work, hobbies, the quirks of living in their suburban town. But as the minutes passed, Jaslyn found herself opening up more than she intended. Maybe it was the anonymity of talking to someone outside her immediate circle. Or maybe it was the way Lucas listened without judgment. Whatever it was, she ended up sharing bits and pieces of her struggles with Rio. "I just don't know if we can fix things," she admitted, stirring her now lukewarm cappuccino. "He says he wants to try, but after so many years of feeling disconnected, I'm not sure how to trust that things will actually change." Lucas nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening. "Relationships are hard," he said simply, "especially when both people are carrying their own baggage. Sometimes it feels easier to shut each other out than to face the messiness of being vulnerable." Jaslyn raised an eyebrow, surprised by his insight. "You sound like you've been through this before." Lucas chuckled dryly, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I have. My ex-wife and I tried counseling for years, but ultimately, we couldn't bridge the gap between us. It taught me a lot about communication, or lack thereof, and how important it is to address problems head-on instead of sweeping them under the rug." His honesty caught Jaslyn off guard. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a quiet wisdom born from experience. "Do you ever regret not trying harder?" she asked softly. "Every day," Lucas admitted. "But regret doesn't fix anything. What matters is learning from those mistakes and applying them to your current situation. If you're willing to fight for your marriage, that's half the battle right there." His words lingered in Jaslyn's mind long after their conversation ended. As she walked home, she replayed his advice over and over again. Relationships require effort, not just from one person, but from both. And while Rio had clearly been struggling, she realized she hadn't exactly been proactive either. She'd spent months nursing her resentment instead of addressing the root causes of their disconnect. When she arrived home, Rio was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. He looked up as she entered, his expression wary. "Hey," he said cautiously. "Everything okay?" Jaslyn nodded, slipping off her scarf and hanging it by the door. "Yeah, actually, I think it might be." She sat down beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I met someone today at the cafe, a guy named Lucas. Remember him from the restaurant?" Rio frowned slightly, clearly puzzled. "The waiter? What does he have to do with anything?" "He gave me some perspective," Jaslyn explained. "Not intentionally, but hearing him talk about his own experiences made me realize something. We've both been holding back, for different reasons, sure, but we haven't really given ourselves a fair shot at fixing things. Not together, anyway." Rio's frown softened into a look of cautious understanding. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to start fresh," Jaslyn said firmly. "No more canceling therapy sessions. No more pretending everything's fine when it's not. Let's go to the next appointment, and actually follow through this time. Together." For the first time in weeks, a small smile tugged at the corners of Rio's lips. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do it." As they sat side by side, the weight of their decision settled between them. Not as a burden, but as a shared commitment. For the first time in a long time, Jaslyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. And for the first time, Rio seemed ready to meet her halfway. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of Jaslyn and Rio's lives began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Their first therapy session together had been awkward, filled with hesitant pauses and moments where old wounds threatened to resurface, but they kept showing up. Week after week, they sat across from Dr. Carter, unraveling years of misunderstandings, unspoken frustrations, and buried emotions. It wasn't easy. There were days when Jaslyn wanted to storm out, and others when Rio retreated into silence. But slowly, painfully, they started to rebuild the foundation of their relationship. One evening, as autumn gave way to winter, Jaslyn found herself standing in front of her easel in the corner of their living room. She hadn't painted in months, not since the weight of their struggles had sapped her creativity. But tonight, she felt an urge she couldn't ignore. With a deep breath, she dipped her brush into vibrant shades of blue and gold, letting the colors flow onto the canvas without overthinking. As she worked, Rio appeared in the doorway, watching quietly. "What are you painting?" he asked after a moment, his voice soft so as not to disturb her focus. Jaslyn glanced over her shoulder, surprised but pleased by his presence. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but it feels hopeful." Rio stepped closer, his eyes scanning the swirls of color taking shape on the canvas. "It's beautiful," he said simply, and for once, his compliment didn't feel like an empty gesture. There was sincerity in his tone, a recognition of how far they'd come. "Thanks," Jaslyn replied, setting her brush down. She wiped her hands on a rag and turned to face him fully. "Do you remember what you said that night at La Belle about doing your best?" Rio nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah. Why?" "I think I finally understand what you meant," she said, her voice steady. "You weren't perfect, and neither was I. But we're here now, aren't we? Still trying. That counts for something." A small smile tugged at Rio's lips. "It does," he agreed. "And I want you to know. I'm grateful for that. For us." Their conversation drifted naturally into lighter topics, plans for the upcoming holidays, updates on work, a funny story about one of Jaslyn's students. And for the first time in years, it felt effortless. The tension that had once loomed between them was gone, replaced by a quiet ease that came from knowing they were truly on the same side. The following weekend, they returned to La Belle. This time, it wasn't part of a desperate attempt to salvage their marriage. It was a celebration. They walked through the doors hand in hand, greeted warmly by Lucas, who recognized them immediately. "Well, look who's back," he said with a grin, handing them menus. "How have things been?" "Going?" Jaslyn exchanged a glance with Rio before answering. "Better," she said honestly. "We've still got work to do, but we're getting there." Lucas nodded approvingly. "That's all anyone can ask for. Progress, not perfection." As they settled into their seats, Jaslyn noticed how different everything felt this time around. Rio wasn't glued to his phone. Instead, he leaned forward, engaged in their conversation. When Lucas brought their food, Rio thanked him sincerely, making small talk about the weather and the restaurant's new decor. It was such a simple interaction, yet it spoke volumes about the changes within him and within them as a couple. After dinner, as they prepared to leave, Jaslyn paused near the host stand. "Lucas," she said, catching his attention. "Thank you. For everything." He looked momentarily confused. "For what?" "For being honest with me that day at the cafe," she explained. "Your perspective really helped me see things differently." Lucas smiled softly, shaking his head. "All I did was share my story. You two did the hard work." Jaslyn nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. For Lucas, for Rio, and most of all, for herself. She had fought for her marriage, not out of obligation, but because she believed it was worth saving. And now, standing here with Rio beside her, she knew she'd made the right choice. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Jaslyn slipped her hand into Rio's. The city lights twinkled above them, casting a gentle glow over the streets. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for their future, but for the journey they were taking together. "You know," Rio said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think we should make this a tradition. Coming here, I mean, maybe once a month." Jaslyn smiled, squeezing his hand. I'd like that. And as they walked home beneath the starlit sky, Jaslyn realized that love wasn't about never falling apart. It was about choosing to put the pieces back together, again and again. Together.